I'm not a religious person at all, but there did seem to be feeling that Liverpool's name was somehow on the trophy. Yeah, this is the fifth best team in England, winning the most important prize of all. But in 2005, it was a bit of a ragtag team, and it was an underdog victory. Whatever thought was going through my head at the time was that sense of fate. I mean, you can't, not the greatest coach in the world can't concoct a scenario where from nowhere Liverpool scored three times inside 7 minutes. It is unlike any other, and it's beyond any explanation.
Clive, thank you very much for joining us today. We're here predominantly to speak about that night 20 years ago. Hard to believe that it was 20 years ago now. You were there. You provided us with some of the most memorable commentary lines in Liverpool Football Club history, not just from that night itself. Just take us back and your overriding thoughts when you initially look back and think back to that night.
The first thing to say is that the game was not played in Istanbul. It was nowhere near Istanbul. And anybody who went remembers that. We did not stay in a hotel in the city. I like Istanbul as a city, and I've covered many games there, Galatasaray and Fenerbahce and Besiktas. But we stayed somewhere fairly close to the stadium. Steve McManaman was part of our punditry team, and he came out, and Robbie Fowler just came out with him. So they were in the hotel. Andy Townsend was co-commentator that night, and the Champions League belonged to ITV. I mean, that was the only place to watch it, and so those games were watched by massive television audiences. I mean, in 2025, even on terrestrial television, 5 million is a really good TV audience. In 2005, we're talking 20 million people. Everybody watched it. Not everybody wanted Liverpool to win. And as a commentator, you kind of had to bear that in mind. But I think it probably was an era when, having had that kind of golden period in the late 70s and into the 80s, where the European Cup seemed to come back to England every year. Manchester United, can I say that? Victory was in 99, was the first for several years. And this was almost the beginning of the next golden age of English teams in the Champions League. And I think that reignited an interest in the competition. And so, I mean, it was the first ever meeting of Liverpool and Milan. It's difficult to think that, and you've only got to look at the names on the Milan team sheet that night to see that it was a kind of appointment to view television event, I think, for the nation, not just for Liverpool fans.
And just going back before we even get to Turkey is, you were privileged to commentate also on the quarter-final and the semi-final. That night at Anfield, people still to this day will insist it is the greatest atmosphere that Anfield has ever witnessed. Would you go along with that? What were your, how are you able to feel the atmosphere? You're so focused on your job, but at the same time, you're trying to portray that atmosphere to the people at home.
Townsend, who is my co-commentator, is a really good football analyst. And I remember him saying time and time again during that run that Liverpool are a great underdog. And that might sound like a rather veiled compliment, but I think even the most ardent Liverpool fan would believe that actually the team that played 2 years later was arguably a better team, maybe gave a better performance in the final of 2007, maybe more deserving of winning in 2007 than in 2005. But it was an underdog's run to the final. Liverpool had lost 19 times that season. And we all know what happened against Olympiacos. The team had evolved by the time Liverpool reached the last eight, so that Sami Hyypiä wasn't a regular starter. So that was a big night for him. Scott Carson. I mean, even going back to Cinema Pongolle and Neil Mellor against Olympiacos, there were some extraordinary stories just in how Liverpool arrived. And I think that my commentary on the night of the final maybe had a sense of that fate has decreed this. The ghost goal against Chelsea. And obviously the way that they came back in the final itself. It, it was. I'm not a religious person at all, but there did seem to be feeling that Liverpool's name was somehow on the trophy, and actually the unlikely events that led to them getting there, the nature of Sammy's goal in the quarter-final, the nature of the deciding goal in the semi-final, and that the kind of rather disjointed look of the lineup that Rafa put on the field that night in Istanbul. It did contribute to this kind of notion that Andy had then, that this is the fifth best team in England. Winning the most important prize of all, and winning it for the fifth time, and therefore for good. So for keeps, as I said at the trophy presentation. So it is a romantic story, and I think that of all the triumphs that Liverpool enjoyed before and after, and even in our commentary charts business, that chart remains the most popular Liverpool chart. And as I said, better Liverpool teams have won this competition before and since. And everything that's been achieved, particularly in the recent years, when I was at Radio City for more than 10 years, we used to play the game of the greatest Liverpool team of all time, even then. And it was, difficult to find a place for whatever Ian St John or Roger Hunt, and now, you have had in the last 5 years 4 or 5 genuine contenders to be in the greatest Liverpool team of all time. That's the era that you are living through, and this is not an underdog Liverpool team anymore. But in 2005, it was a bit of a ragtag team, and it was an underdog victory.
Yeah, I think that people forget that it was Benitez's first season inherited not a very strong squad, to say the least. And he hadn't really had any opportunity to put his marker on that in terms of the squad itself and the playing style. Like you say, fifth best team in the league at the time, and there were some heavy results. But I think that I certainly noticed at the time he almost used the preceding league game as a dry run for the following Champions League game. He'd often use a system that he was then going to use in the Champions League, in the midweek, and that was almost like the friendly that preceded the real action. So we'll forgive him for that. They're all forgiven. Like you say, it's a very romantic story. You provided us with that famous line, Gerrard's first goal, hello, hello, here we go. I think that everybody just needs to hear those. It's only a few words in the English dictionary, but to any Liverpool fan, we know exactly who is saying it and what they're talking about. Just talk to us about that line and how it came about.
The thought, whatever thought was going through my head at the time, was that sense of fate. Let's remember how they got here in the first place. And obviously, the Olympiacos night was, the epitome of that feeling that somehow this is written in the stars. How close they came going out of the competition in the first phase. As I say, the unlikely events in the quarter and semi-final, the kind of contentious nature of the semi-final, but again the romance of it all. It just fed into the narrative. And you just wouldn't. You always felt that you wouldn't put it past them. Having said that, I spent half time combing through my notes, trying to find Liverpool's heaviest ever victory in Europe and the heaviest victory that the team had suffered in a European Cup final, because quite frankly, Milan were 3 up going on 33. And it, I mean, that the stories that emanate around the halftime period, I'm not saying any of them are untrue, but I think that they have probably been embellished a little with the passing of time. The singing of "You'll Never Walk Alone" was kind of defiant. I dare say if Milan had scored in the first 5 minutes of the second half, one or two people might have started to try to find their way back into central Istanbul a bit earlier. What happened in the dressing room has been recorded, particularly by a book by Guillaume Balaguer some years ago, as being somewhat chaotic. And I'm not trying to take anything at all away from Rafa, who engineered the victory, but it has been confirmed by more than one source that he gave a team talk with 10 counters on the board and then a team talk with 12 counters on the board. Jimmy Traore was coming off. Steve Finnan then had a bit of a rant because he was brought off. Diddy was sent out to warm up and didn't really know any of what was happening. So it was, it did come together in that same kind of almost fictional, romantic manner. And Stephen's goal triggered all of that. And in fairness to Rafa, I think it probably his best parts of the night were later on. The way he used Stephen when Serginho came on, the way he used Stephen initially at the start of the second half to play in front of Alonso and Harman somehow looked a better balance altogether. He switched then Smitzer and Gerrard late. So he was making tactical changes, which certainly helped Liverpool on the way to victory. But I mean, you can't, not the greatest coach in the world can't concoct a scenario where from nowhere Liverpool scored 3 times inside 7 minutes, have a penalty saved but still score. Where some of the unlikeliest heroes of the night, Jimmy's goal line clearance, and I think that Smitzer played really well when he came on, and he didn't have his shin pads ready when Harry Kewell got surprise, got injured. You couldn't write the script if somebody asked you to sit down and pen a script for a European Cup final, which had an element of escape to victory about it. You wouldn't dare write the script that the game followed, and it was. I'm often asked, best match, greatest match. I think it's the most remarkable big match I ever commentated on, because I watched it back a couple of nights later, as I always do, and you still couldn't explain it. You couldn't. There was no good. Weirdly, Liverpool scored 3 times in 7 minutes, and Milan carried on playing, carried on dominating the game. It was like it hadn't happened. It was like, what was that? And it wasn't. You couldn't make a case really for that. Even Jersey's saves were. He couldn't do that again. I mean, he didn't know how he'd made the saves. It wasn't like he'd thrown himself down to his left and scooped it out by the post. It kind of hit his arm where it was. So I'm sound like I'm devaluing it. I hope I'm actually adding to the magic of the night. What makes it so wonderful is that it's beyond any reason or explanation. It's not about Rafa's strategic abilities. It's not about anything that any one player did. Although I think Stephen's own personal performance in 3 different positions was probably one of the greatest individual performances. I'm going to say something really unkind, actually, to stop rambling. I don't know how many medals were given out that night. I think that this is a terrible, damning thing I'm about to say. I think that 4 or 5 of them probably didn't really deserve one, and that actually the likes of Cara and Stephen should have been given 2 or 3 each. It was one of those team performances where some of the winners really didn't play very well, but Johnson didn't have a great night. He really didn't. He looked shaky all night. Yeah, he's made the saves that he did and won the shootout. Jimmy Traore, bless him, was not a great left back, but he made the goal line clearance. And there's Jamie throwing himself around, making block after block, and Stephen excelling himself in every corner of the field. And one or two others make, Xavi obviously played really well. Didi made an impact. I actually say I think Smeets played well on the night.
Definitely.
But yeah, there are one or two I haven't mentioned who we can't really remember what they contributed to the evening other than that they were there or they went up and collected a winner's medal. But that is the magic of that night. It is unlike any other, and it's beyond any explanation.
I think that beautifully said, by the way. I think that it sort of sums up that era for Liverpool Football Club as well, in that Steven Gerrard dragged Liverpool through football games and Jamie Carragher shortly behind him. During that whole sort of decade, at times there was games where if it wasn't for Steven Gerrard, you did fear for where Liverpool Football Club would have ended up being. But as you mentioned, and you sort of alluded to there, but in your commentary on the night, mission impossible is accomplished. Was that a line that you had pre-prepared at halftime, or is it just that I'm
Well,
purely...
I knew what was going to happen. No, they didn't give me a script in advance. No, I think. Listen, this is my job, so I take it seriously. We don't save lives or add anything to the GDP of the nation. We're football commentators. We shout names out, but you try when you get the opportunity to work at the highest level. You try to add something to people's experience of a night. Football matches have an uncommonly huge influence on us in terms of we recall them long after far more important events in our lives have sort of faded into the ether. I think I've probably been fortunate enough to recognise the importance of these games and these memories. We're talking about this 20 years on. And I had a mentor who taught me 95% of what I know about communication, let alone commentary. He was a boxing commentator, actually, Reg Guttridge. And Reg, one of the many, many sort of pointers that he gave to me, bullet points, was that every great moment in football is unique and it deserves its own words. If you're fortunate enough to call a big moment in a game, then amazing, brilliant, fantastic is not enough. It's got to be something more than that. It's got to be something that captures the significance and drama of that moment. And so I think that when you find yourself in the midst of a game that has changed course and has started to take on a life of its own, you are trying to concentrate on the action you're watching and then ask yourself, what on earth am I going to say they equalize here? What on earth am I going to say? You're trying to cover all the bases. You're trying to anticipate what comes next. I remember Dejan Lovren's goal against Dortmund, and I was actually asking myself before the ball was tossed into the penalty area, what am I going to say here if Liverpool score at the Kop end and complete another extraordinary comeback? And it is part of the discipline, or it should be part of the discipline. And I don't want to sound too bitchy, but I'm always disappointed when a commentator doesn't find any words. And we all know that the kind of feint that Martin Tyler of the Aguero goal. It's not him shouting Aguero. It's him saying, "I swear you'll never see anything like this again," which is a huge call to make in the heat of the moment. But actually, editorially, it's a fantastic call because even Michael Thomas's goal at Anfield, that infamous night, wasn't the same as that. City had scored twice in stoppage time to win the league from Manchester United, and what we witnessed in Istanbul that night yeah, you had to be thinking, thinking what am I watching here? What am I going to say? And funny enough, my regret on the night was Shevchenko walking forward to take the penalty. And think Brian, the late great Brian Moore was my predecessor, and Brian's relationship with the television audience was so strong. Millions of people who never met him instinctively loved him because of his warmth and he was so genuine and authoritative. And it takes a long time to even get anywhere remotely close to that. But the one mistake that Brian made in his career really was asking Kevin Keegan whether he thought somebody was going to score in a penalty shootout. It was a stupid thing to do. Why? Yeah, how do we know? And he just sort of did it instinctively, and Kevin tried his best, and the penalty was missed. And as Shevchenko walked forward, I had this voice scream in my head: he doesn't want to be here. He doesn't want to take this penalty. I wanted to predict that he wasn't going to score. And he scored in a shootout, scored decisively in a shootout 2 years earlier at Old Trafford. So it wasn't, I had all that information. This is one of the most famous players in the world, but it was almost the moment we knew that Liverpool had finally worn Milan down that night. That, that Milan was shaking their heads, thinking, "We're never going to be these guys." And Shevchenko walked forward, and he just didn't look as if he wanted to be there. And in a in a way, even though it would have broken the rules, I wish I'd said that because yeah, I mean, it was a weak penalty and a glorious moment. But yeah, I think probably the moment you mentioned the hello. I think the moment I had prepared, because you always prepare something for the kind of final whistle and for the trophy presentation, not a script, just a few kind of bullet points, just a reminder of how long it is since Liverpool have won the European Cup or whatever, just so it's there for you. And I had written under Liverpool trophy lift, this time it's for keeps. And I think that's the bit that always kind of puts a bit of a shiver when I hear it back. That because, and I think we'd probably refer to this also in the commentary, that for Liverpool fans of that generation, and you're probably one of them, you had to listen to Dad and Granddad going on and on and on about Dalglish and Rush and Souness and Paisley and maybe even about St John and Shankly beforehand. And you did have a pretty ordinary team to watch compared to all of that. And this was your night. This was your night to turn around to dad or to grandma and say, by the way, what about those? What about these boys? Did Dalglish do this? No. And so I think it was a special night for Liverpool fans of a certain age because it was your victory. And I think we've seen that again in recent years under Jurgen and now, under Arne Slot. These victories belong essentially to the ones that can't remember 2005, can't remember the 1980s, can't remember the 1970s. And so I think it is a very particular victory for Liverpool fans of a certain age. Keeps.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You couldn't have nailed it anymore. People of my generation and the article that I'm pre-writing for 442 for publication on hopefully Monday revolves around the title win. Obviously, 35 years now we've waited to actually be able to be there to watch this Liverpool team win the league.
Mm.
So the sort of synonyms are there with the 2005. We finally get to witness Liverpool Football Club being champions of Europe, and now we finally get to witness Liverpool Football Club being champions of England, being there in person, because we've not actually experienced that. I'm in an extremely privileged position that I've seen Liverpool win every single trophy possible. But this getting this next one over the line. Just back on Istanbul, the final question I wanted to ask on Istanbul specifically is when you put down that microphone and you've gone off air and you've composed yourself throughout, it's well gone midnight at this point. It's been a very, I would say, exhausting game to work and be involved in. What goes through your mind there? Do you look at Ali and just say, what on earth have we just witnessed?
to the hotel eventually, which is if you the hotel was not in the middle of Istanbul. It wasn't too far away, and they'd sorted a car for us to get back and stuff. So we probably got back in time to have a noggin or two. And the best thing was Robbie Fowler said, "Guy, you were really harsh on Harry." I said, "What?" He said, you really give Harry Kewell some stick." And yeah, I suppose it's weird what a footballer remembers. But I'll never forget that. I thought, God, all the stuff I've come up with tonight, you won, Anyway, there you go. I'm sorry to mention it, but the only comparable commentary that I did for ITV in that era was Manchester United's victory 6 years earlier. And that night in Barcelona, I could walk back to the hotel that we were staying in. And on the way back to the hotel, I was asking myself whether I'd oversold the victory to an audience of 20 odd million people that would include a lot of ABUs, including a lot of Liverpool fans and City fans and Leeds fans and West Ham fans. And I turned before I went down for a Rioja or six with the rest of the ITV team, I had Sky News in the room, and there was an element of almost like an England tournament victory about it. I think the fact that it had been so long since the European Cup had resided in England, the fact that we'd beaten the Germans, which, is not a kind of a war reference. It's more to do with all those bloody penalty shootouts that England lost and so on. And the fact that Manchester United had sort of done it in their way, and it was a treble, but they'd done it kind of how they did it, how they rolled that Ferguson team. I think that even the staunchest Liverpool or City or Leeds fan, probably for half an hour that night, thought, on you go, well done, fair play. You'll get dogs abuse when you come to our place in August, but yeah, enjoy your night. And I think I think the fact that I'd sort of gone through that and felt that actually you've got to go with the moment. You can't be thinking when Liverpool win the European Cup in that style, you can't be worrying about the Everton fans or the United fans who are thinking, "Oh God," you've got to somehow celebrate that moment. And it's interesting in the 21st century where we've got very much the kind of fan commentator, the kind of Rio Ferdinand, Carras, Mo Salah, Little Dancer, and all that stuff. I'm not sure in my own old mind that isn't a step too far, but I think that the lead commentator can go with the moment and celebrate it as if it's our victory, as probably European Cup victories in the late 70s and 80s were celebrated by English football fans as a victory for us, rather than specifically for Forest or Villa or for Liverpool. And I went with it that night, obviously, because it was so dramatic and so glorious, and because it meant so much, the fifth victory and keeping the trophy. And so I probably, because of the 99 experience, I was more confident in kind of eulogizing about what we'd seen and doing justice to the remarkable nature of the victory and the achievement, and therefore Liverpool fans could enjoy it as if I were a Liverpool fan, really.
So what you're saying basically is that those iconic lines that you provided us with, we have Manchester United to thank for that.
Something like that. No, I mean, that experience, I think I think, I mean, without talking about the Merseyside derby rivalry, it definitely changed. I arrived on Merseyside in '77, and those first big derbies. There was a big semi-final in '77, which went to two games, and then obviously the League Cup final seemed like the biggest derby of all time in '84. And everybody chanting Merseyside together at the end of that game, almost like defiantly, we're down, London, we're here. And And there was it is an unusual derby in so much that it does divide households and streets, and it isn't kind of, you don't support along religious lines or whatever really. So, but that changed. Whether Heysel changed it and Everton not being in the European Cup. I mean, it came back together when Everton as a football club supported Liverpool in the wake of Hillsborough. I think that derby changed, but I think it was probably more a sign of the times. I think we became a bit more tribal about our football, and maybe we were more likely to want Liverpool to lose or United to lose or Chelsea to lose if we weren't a fan of that club. And so as a commentator, you had to kind of take that into account, and you couldn't go top gear at the end of a final in maybe the way that Brian and John Motson and Barry Davies could have done in an earlier era. But I think the nature of that Liverpool victory, you'd have to be a pretty piece of blue not to say it. Go on you go, enjoy it.
Well, on behalf of all Liverpool fans, I would like to thank you for providing us with those iconic lines.
Oh, I can only do it if the material's there. I can't. It's funny you mentioned that. Hello, hello, and it came to mind again with the recent game against PSG. I commentated on. You'd have to remind me of the year that the semi-final in Parc de France when Liverpool stunk the place out, lost 3-0. And we ITV, I still call them we, even though they've been me. We had the second leg, I guess, a week later.
Yeah.
And when it got to 2-0, and Liverpool were terrible that night, I'm basically calling it as such. And I very rarely got a boss in my ear saying, come on, we've got the second leg next week. You'd sell this, come on. And so I actually picked up the commentary a little bit in response to this. And then PSG scored a third. And I've got a secret key where I can talk to the editor without you hearing it. And I pressed it and said, what fucking now then? But as it was, for nearly, Liverpool won the second leg 2-0. So, yeah, hello. But there was, I think probably in my mind, a half-time. I mean, the nature of the third Milan goal was just so breathtakingly beautiful. Lukaku was now purring and running the game. And, Liverpool, they had an injury. I think Shevchenko had one disallowed for a kind of borderline. There was one cleared off the line in the first half, wasn't there? So it really looked as if they were in for a hiding. But before the boss said anything in my ear, I tried to revive a little bit of hope that possibly Liverpool was still in this. But when I said hello, did I foresee 2 more goals in the next 6 minutes? No, I didn't.
I'm not sure anybody did. Clive, it's been an absolute pleasure. We could reminisce about that game for a long, long time because I think it's just one of those ones like Man Walks on the Moon or, a historical event in time that will live with Liverpool supporters throughout history. And unfortunately for everybody else that was watching it that wasn't a Liverpool supporter, they always have to remember that was the greatest European Cup final of all time. So, thank you again, and thank you for your time today. If anybody wants to, Clive has his commentary charts available for, like he says, the Istanbul game is always a bestseller, but there'll also be one, I believe, coming out to commemorate the title-winning campaign, number 20.
We do 2 kinds of commentary charts. Commentarycharts.com are the prints of my research notes for big games, and obviously the 2005 final is on there. But in recognition of a famous season, I also keep week by week records of results and appearances and so on for most of the major teams, and so I've kind of reproduced in 2020 the chart for all Liverpool's games in that title winning season with some of the records that they broke detailed underneath. And yeah, that chart will now it's very, very popular one, and it will soon have a sister chart to sit alongside it with the story of how number 20 was won.